Hello and welcome back to The Vegan Runner. In this video I'm taking a look back over my first ultramarathon race to the Stones 100k. We'll get into what went well, what didn't go so well, and what I'll do differently next time. Let's go. Right, so my first ultra marathon, my first time putting one foot in front of the other for 100 kilometers, and for the most part I had an absolute blast. It was by far the toughest thing I've ever done, but 5 years on from being inspired by ultra runners to taking up running and then one day covering an ultra marathon distance, I really couldn't be happier to have that experience and that achievement under my belt. I feel like generally I performed well and on the whole I had a pretty good race. Now if you'd said to me about 12 months ago that I'd run it in about 10 hours and finish 7th overall, I'd have never believed you. But you know, it didn't all go to plan. There were some unanticipated issues along the way and quite a few lessons learnt. But first let's explore what went well. So first up, I was really happy with all of the gear I decided to go with on race day, particularly this pack from Harrier, the Kinder 10 litre. Now on the build up to the race day, Taper Madness took over a little bit, and quite late in the game I started searching for another pack that was a bit smaller and a bit more lightweight. Now for Race to the Stones there's no mandatory kit list, and it's just a kind of suggested kit list, and I was pretty certain I wasn't going to be out there long enough to kind of like need a head torch and some of the other gear that's suggested on that list, so the 10 litre capacity of the Kinder was a bit much. So I ended up buying a couple of different vests to try out, but just couldn't dial in the fit perfectly like I had with the Kinder. So eventually sanity won over and I went for the Kinder 10 litre. Now if you have this vest, a little tip for you is to get the vest even more secure, is to use the cords at the side. I think they're the pole sort of loops. And if you can kind of hook them through one another, you can cinch them down and you can tighten them down on the sides. And then I found that the pack is like ultra secure, it doesn't bounce hardly at all. Now I'm finding I need to have that kind of lockdown on the side of most of my running vests now to stop them from bouncing, and very few vests have anything that kind of just sort of cinches in the sides and holds everything secure. So if you know of a vest that's lightweight and has that kind of security along the sides and things like that, let me know, because I'm getting a little bit annoyed with all the bounce of the bottles and stuff like that. Anyway, so that little workaround on the Kinder just locked the fit right in for race day, and it performed exceptionally well. Tons of pockets, the bottles are actually really easy to get in and out of at the aid stations, and the side pockets are really easy to access, and everything just seemed to go well with the vest. Now the shorts I went with, these are the Marathon 2.0 shorts by Soar. These worked like an absolute dream. They were super lightweight, really airy, and just a pleasure to run in. Now, I haven't put these shorts through their full paces yet though. They have these kind of cool gel loops and pockets to store gels on the back that I've yet to try out, but once I have, look out soon for the full review. Then there was the shoes. Now I went with trail shoes. There's quite a bit of debate leading up to the race among people in the support groups about which type of shoe would be best, whether the Ridgeway was more suited to road or trail shoes. For the most part, I was happy to have gone with the Speedgoat 5 by Hoka. They didn't let me down for really any part of the race, and they gave me a lot of protection from some of the more technical, rocky sections of the trail, which I wouldn't have got from road shoes. Now, they were a little bit uncomfortable, particularly in the latter stages of the race, whilst on the sort of like tarmac, longer sort of tarmac sections, but once again, back on the trail, they were absolutely perfect. As for the last bit of really important gear, I was wearing my watch, the Garmin Fenix 6. Absolutely no problems with this whatsoever. I had the entire course uploaded to the watch, and I used this on race day. Didn't really need to, as the signage was absolutely brilliant along the route, but there were a couple of times, particularly near the end, where I was glad to have the route on my watch, as my tired old eyes may have missed an arrow or just not noticed it, and just wanted to check that I was still heading the right way. Now, at the end of the race, it still had tons of battery life left, and I was really impressed with how it performed once again, just completely faultless. Okay, so another thing that went well on race day was my time at the aid stations. Now, Garmin data reckons that I spent about 12 minutes stationary, which would be most of my time, I think, at aid stations, like filling up bottles and grabbing the fruit and gels. Now, I'd read before the race that aid stations are often where people lose more time than they think, so I was pretty conscious to get in and out of them pretty quickly, even when I felt just like taking a few more moments rest. I just kept moving, kept going, grabbed what I needed really quickly and got out of there. Now, the upside to this was that I was on the move again really quickly. The slight downside to this was that I sometimes forgot to grab something, so like an extra gel, a bar, or a piece of fruit. It was never anything calamitous, so overall I was pretty happy with how that went. And I found that as aid stations approached, if I mentally went through what I needed to grab, pulled out the bottles and slightly unscrewed them first, it just made the whole thing much quicker. And a really big thanks to the volunteers at aid stations 6 and 7 who helped get the bottles filled up nice and quickly and get them unscrewed and all that kind of stuff. That was just awesome to have some help there in the later stages where undoing the bottle was just becoming a bit too hard. Another positive I will take away from this race, and this links to some things that didn't go so well, and I'll get into those in a second, but I was really happy with my mental resilience throughout the race. When things weren't going well, I kept on going, and at times I just listened to my body. I pushed it when it needed pushing, and I eased off when there was no other option. Now, there were moments fairly early into the race, I guess around about 60k or so, when I was in quite a lot of pain, and I'm really happy that I didn't give up there, and I didn't want to give in there. I knew that if I just kept putting one foot in front of the other, I'd get there eventually. The pain and discomfort would pass, and I just needed to keep pushing on. I was also happy with the sleep and rest and the taper up until race day. I didn't have the best night's sleep before race day, but it wasn't awful. I was just excited to get to the start line, and it's always tricky to get a decent night's sleep when you're nervous and excited the night before a race. I was also a little worried about the early start of the race. It was 6:30 a.m. Typically I wouldn't be up and about and running at that time in the morning, but in the end it didn't seem to have a kind of detrimental effect, so I wouldn't worry about that again in the future unless it was like super ultra early, but that seemed to be about fine. My body adjusted. I think the excitement and the adrenaline of the start time really just got me through that, more so than in a training run where it's a lot more difficult to get out and up at that time in the morning. Finally, for the positives, and I'll try to keep this one brief for fear of tooting my horn too loudly, but I'm really happy with my time and position given the brutal heat and that it was my first ultra. I finished in 10 hours and 2 minutes in 7th place overall. I felt like I finished pretty strong, climbing 2 places in the last 5k, and I've since found out there were some pretty serious athletes out there on the course that day, so overall I'm very, very pleased with that time and position. Alright, that's the good stuff out of the way. Now for what didn't go so well. I alluded to this one earlier, but at around about 60k or so, I got this huge stitch. Now, most of the time it was just a kind of background nuisance. It was just a kind of annoying sort of niggling pain, but at times, especially when running downhill, it was incredibly painful. And on the way into aid station 6 is quite a decent steep, kind of technical downhill section. It was absolutely killing me, and I usually love downhills. I usually like to brain off, brakes off and actually fly down them, but on some of these downhills I actually had to stop and then walk them, and then into aid station 6 had to actually walk a bit of the flat road section after that until it eased up a little. And it was on and off with me really for most of the race after that, so once it eased up a little, it got going again, and then it was sort of on and off until the end of the race. Now, it stayed up to me until around about the final couple of kilometres, where I think the kind of excitement of finishing, seeing the stones off in the distance, and that sort of final push to the end kind of blocked it out of my mind. So why is this something that didn't go well? I think that the stitch was mostly caused by the high five aqua gels that they were giving out at aid stations. Now, I've used these before without issues, but I remember having one of these gels just after the stitch had eased off, and then almost instantly it came back with a vengeance. Now, it also came on after eating some Skittles too. It was kind of like, so I'd eat the Skittles and then almost instantly the stitch was back. So it might have just been that my body had had just enough of that kind of high sugar hit, and it just needed me to stop taking them on. Now, I tried fruit at the aid stations after that, and it was so much better. Perhaps the universe is trying to tell me that whole natural foods is the way to go here during ultras. And just a little aside on the High Five Aqua Gels, I'm going to be giving these a wide berth in the future. Not because of the stitch really, but because they're just so runny. It's impossible to run with them and not spill the contents over your hands, which then proceed to get extremely sticky. Gels are always a little bit messy, but those Aqua Gels are easily the worst I've tried on that front, just because they're so liquidy. I think that's a word. Now, for something else that didn't quite go to plan on race day was my heart rate. So I was aiming to complete most of the run in zone 1. Now, for me, that's between about 132 to 148 beats per minute and about 75% of my max heart rate. My average heart rate for the entire race was 163 beats per minute, which is at the top end of my zone 2 range. At one point I wondered if my heart rate monitor was glitching. Sometimes it can take a little while to wake up, but looking at the data, it gives a pretty consistent reading throughout the race. I was definitely out fast for the first quarter of the race, which would explain the heart rate being slightly more elevated than planned. But the kind of paces I was running would usually see me in zone 1, so it was a bit strange. Take, for example, the first sustained downhill at mile 8. My heart rate is around 153. I'm heading downhill at about an 8-minute mile. Now, that pace on the flat is usually zone 1 for me, so something strange was definitely going on with my heart rate. Now, I suspect it was down to the heat. It was about 20 degrees Celsius by that time in the race, or 68 Fahrenheit. Now, pretty early on in the race, it climbed up to a high of 34 degrees by about sort of base camp sort of way just after, again, about the 60-kilometer sort of stage. It was really hot. So in the early stages, I could just about keep my heart rate near zone 1 for short periods if I really focused on slowing down. But in the mid to later stages of the race, it just wasn't going to happen. It wasn't even getting into zone 1 whilst I was walking. So now, since the race, I've done a little bit of research, and it's clearly heat stress that my cardiovascular system was working hard on in order to sort of keep my body cool. I ended up running most of the race in zone 2 and sometimes going a little bit higher than that. And on reflection, it's made me feel a lot of gratitude for my CV system. I was way off plan according to my heart rate data almost from the first step of the 100-kilometer race. And yeah, my cardiovascular system was able to cope with that huge amount of stress that I was putting it under, and the heat was putting it under. Now, it makes me wonder a couple of things. Now, would I have been faster overall if I had slowed down and stuck to zone 1 despite the heat? And would I have experienced the gastric distress with the gels if my heart rate wasn't going so high? And finally, it's made me wonder how I could run a race in cooler conditions where it's a bit easier to keep that heart rate under control. These are like really interesting questions, especially that last one. If I was to take on, say, an autumn or winter, early spring ultra race where the heat isn't an issue, if I can keep my heart rate in zone 1, what's that going to look like in terms of pace and stuff like that? Now, another thing that was hard to stay on top of, and again, it was related to the heat, was staying on top of hydration. Now, I had done my research beforehand, and most guides recommend sort of anywhere between drinking 400 to 800 ml per hour. Now, I was carrying 2 bottles, one with a sugary powder inside and another just plain water. Both of them are half a litre each, so in theory, more than enough to go on between aid stations. In training, this had translated to about 1 bottle per hour, and for my ultra, that would have meant filling up at every other aid station, roughly, as these were about 10 to 15 kilometres apart. And the plan started well. I ran through aid station 1, not needing to fill up, and then I fully filled up at at aid station 2 and restocked with the sugary powders and gels and things. I went into aid station 3 just to pick up some nutrition, and then I filled up again at aid station 4. And then every aid station after that, as the temperature really sort of took off and climbed, I stopped in every aid station to fill up from that point on. And then sometimes I was finding that I was out of liquid way before I reached the aid station, so I tended to make sure I had a good drink at the pit stop before refilling and setting off. And I just hadn't considered really just how much more fluid I'd need to take on as the temperatures climbed. And I can just thank my lucky stars really that it didn't completely derail my race. So those were the major issues I faced and the things that went well. So here's what I've learned from my first ultra and what I do differently for my next race. First up, in my next race, I will definitely be more disciplined with the hills. Now, this is something that I have been working on in training, but with the excitement of the race, I definitely ran more of the hills in the first half of the race than I should have. Sometimes it was because I was running with a group of people and it was just kind of difficult to stop. Sometimes it was because the hill was so gradual, it just kind of felt weird to walk, and it's also a strange feeling to stop whilst you're feeling good and let people overtake you. Now, if my heart rate wasn't so high because of the heat, I could have been more disciplined with sticking to the zones, but I didn't really have that to fall back on, so I ran to fill instead. And that's kind of tricky when you're excited and energized in race conditions. Now, a memory from the race that sticks with me is when I was running up a hill, merrily chatting to the person next to me. We overtook someone, and and as we passed, he said, "Whoa, crazy people running up the hills." And that probably should have checked us there and then, but at that point in the race, about 20 miles in, legs were still fairly fresh and we were just kind of ticking along. I think with ultra running, this is something that comes with experience. You know you're going to feel good in those early stages. You know you're going to be really suffering in the latter stages. The more hills you walk, the easier the final few miles are going to be, or that second half of the race is going to be. So next ultra, walk the hills, stick to the plan. Also, something to bear in mind for my next ultra would be to remember that there will be competitors from other distances starting with you. Now, at the start, some people set an absolutely blazing pace, and it took a few of us back. At one narrow section of the course, a group of runners were sticking to a fairly speedy pace in the sort of early 10 to 20 miles of the course. And a few of us sort of stuck with them, and then we got sort of talking to one another, and it wasn't for a little while until we realised that some people were doing the 50k and they were blasting off, and a few of us had got caught up with them who were doing the 100k straight through. And again, I think that just comes down to experience and is a bit of a reminder to stick to the plan and not worry about how anyone else is running the race. Just run your own race and keep to your strategy as much as you can. Next up, for my next ultra then, I will be a little bit more disciplined with race research and what gels and things they'll have at the aid stations, and practice with them more in my training. Now, because I tried the High Five gels before, I didn't use them in my training, and I may have paid for it on race day. I think I'm going to kind of lean towards taking on more whole foods and fruit in future races, as that's what my body really seemed to like in the last stage of this race. So with a bit more practice, I'll get used to that in training for my next one, and hopefully that will lead to better results in the future, rather than just kind of relying on whatever gels the race is sponsored by. It could be pretty much anything. Now, if the race has fewer aid stations or is going to be run in similar weather conditions, I will also definitely carry a third water bottle. It can be empty to start with, and then I can fill it up at the aid stations and carry it in my hand if I really need to. I think that extra hydration would have come in handy for sure, and it would have saved a little bit of time at aid stations as I stopped to drink at them before refilling, and maybe it would have given me peace of mind as my 2 bottles emptied, and then not knowing how far away the next water stop was going to be. Running out of water sets in just a little bit of panic there, and also I could have taken on the hydration that I needed rather than kind of reserving it until I got to the aid station or close enough to the next aid station. So carry a spare water bottle is a good one, I think. Finally then, and this is something I began to learn in my longer training runs, but just because of the length of the ultra, it became even more apparent, and that is that everything eventually passes. Life is transient, and within an ultra, whatever you're experiencing, whether it's joy, pain, a great big stitch, a beautiful view, a battering from the sun, smooth running where you can't find the flow, whatever it might be, it all passes eventually. Some things come and go in waves, but nothing lasts forever. And this realization has helped me in a couple of ways. So first of all, it helps me to appreciate the good times on the trail, the great views, the weather, the shade, the breeze, whatever it might be. It's going to pass, enjoy it whilst you can. And it also helps me to see the light at the end of the tunnel when it gets pretty tough. So a long winding hill, beating sun without shade, tightness in the hip, a headwind, whatever it might be, it too is going to pass and it will get easier again. Now, I found myself remembering this in shorter training runs, and it's just helped to appreciate the good or persevere and push through the tougher times. So my first ultra marathon, 100 kilometers were completed, and a lot of lessons were learned along the way. Now, as with almost every race, things happen that you can't always anticipate, but you can always reflect afterwards and think about what went well, what didn't, and what you do differently next time. In an upcoming video, I'm going to review the race, so focusing on the course, the conditions, the organisation of the race. I'll give a pretty good course description in a lot of detail and more information on like the aid stations and that kind of thing. So if you're running it next year or thinking about running it in the future, have a look out for that one. Thanks for watching, and if you've enjoyed this video, hit that like and subscribe button, share it amongst your friends, and until the next one, be the best you.